Morning. Good morning. Good morning, people of LinkedIn. Good morning. Happy Friday. Good morning. If you are watching live, please say good morning in the comments. If you're watching on the replay, thank you for joining. But good morning, everyone. Good morning. Let me know if you're out there. We are doing the Future of DEI Part 6, and we've got a slight change to the agenda. So my special guest, Joanne Conway, unfortunately, has come down with the lurgy, right? In the UK, there's a lot of that going around. And I know Joanne has children of school age, shall we say. We know that the little rugrats often bring the germs home with them, right? So Joanne has been hit by the lurgy, but I am due to be joined, fingers crossed, by another special guest. I'm not going to spoil it by saying who they are, but yeah, if you're joining us live, please say good morning. So we're still going to be talking about social mobility, right, and the link to social mobility in terms of, so we call this the rise of social mobility, and what we're going to talk about really today is how social mobility in terms of the pecking order of diversity and inclusion topics kind of has risen, right? So not only has social mobility risen as a topic that's of interest to individuals out there generally in the public domain, but also within the topics around diversity, equity and inclusion, we have seen social mobility become elevated. So that's what we're going to be talking about this morning. So hope you've all had a good week. How has your week been? What do we even mean by social mobility? So I'm hoping that when our special guest comes on, he's going to help. He's going to help to sort of put some words around it. What do we mean by social mobility? So I'm just waiting for him to jump on. But some of you will have seen in the post to this, one of the things that I said was, in terms of social mobility, the Trade Union Congress here in the UK, so if you're UK based, the TUC, as they're sometimes known, did actually make an appeal for social mobility, or rather socioeconomic status, to be a protected characteristic in the same way that other aspects of our identity are, like race, like gender, etc. It hasn't happened officially. So if you were to look at the equalities legislation, you will see that social mobility or socioeconomic status isn't actually a protected characteristic, although it has risen to prominence. Right, my special guest is backstage. Let's just bring him on. Mac Alonga, you've stepped into the breach.
Hi, Cheryl. How's it going?
It's good, Mac. Thank you so much for joining. Mac, you're live on LinkedIn. Please do not swear.
Amazing. My favorite platform.
Yeah.
And thanks for pulling me up on not being active.
So when I heard that that Joanne potentially couldn't make yesterday, I got in touch with Mac, and Mac, who was actually supposed to have joined me last. It was in December. It was in December, wasn't
Yeah,
it?
end of last
And
year.
you weren't well, actually. So these things happen, right? So I was like, Mac, come on, let's jump on and talk about this really important topic. So Mac's had no prep, but you're a pro, right, Mac? So
I try to be. We'll see how this goes. This might be like a moment that you regret forever, but we'll see.
Never. Bernadette's off the mark already. So I was just saying, Mac, that obviously, the TUC did make this call for socioeconomic status, or class, as it's sometimes referred to be added into like the equalities legislation to become protected, but it didn't happen. But Bernadette, good morning, Bernadette Thompson, OBE. Bernadette has said the Equalities Act needs a refresh, which is interesting. Would you agree with that, Mac? Put you on the spot straight away.
So,
Thanks, Bernadette.
Yeah, so it definitely needs a refresh. But I think actually what it's missing is teeth. It's kind of one of these legislations that's often referred to. People know about it, but what are the consequences of not adhering to what the legislation says? It's just one of these kind of toothless pieces of paper that often gets ignored, and everyone knows it gets ignored. And there's all of these non-disclosure agreements that are prevalent, where people have blatantly been discriminated against, blatantly been harassed, blatantly been victimized, but again, nothing's really done.
What's really interesting as well, talking about like the Equalities Act bit here, and obviously there's the the potential inclusion or not of like socioeconomic status, but have you ever done that comparison of like the protected characteristics between the UK and the US? Because that's kind of interesting, isn't it? In terms, and then at the US, you've kind of you've kind of got I think I did a post about it. If I can find it, I'll dig it out. But it's way back, so LinkedIn. It's hard to find anything on LinkedIn. But basically, you've got, because obviously in the US you've got the federal system and the state system anyway. Mm-hmm. So I feel like saying like at federal level there are fewer. So obviously in the UK we have 9. At federal level, I'm going to say maybe it's 6 or 7. I know that gender reassignment isn't in there. Obs. So that's not in there.
Well, I'm sure Trump's working to remove the rest of them.
Yeah, and then at a state level, then it differs as well by state. So it's I think sometimes people don't realize how different the landscape is in the US in terms of just even the Equalities Act legislation. So as Bernadette says, if and as you've said, Mac, if we think it's a little bit toothless here in the UK, you want to try looking at what it is in the States, right? It's a whole nother ball game. So let's go on. What are you going to say, Mac?
No, I was just agreeing.
Yeah, it's very true. So so in terms of social mobility, would you say, so one of the things, this was called the rise of social mobility, and so I was coming at this from the angle of it seems to have gained more prominence in recent years. Would you agree with that? Have you seen that with clients and stuff that you're working with?
Yeah, absolutely. I think it's one of the things that organizations universally get behind, so that they all have an understanding, especially in more traditional environments. So I come from an energy and utilities background, and there is quite a high prevalence of kind of privately educated, upper middle class individuals. So I think it's something that people acknowledge readily, and therefore it seems like a logical step to take.
Yeah.
I'm not sure how much you want me to go into the nuances of why that potentially is, but I think it's something that has been rising in prominence in recent years.
Yeah, well, we will definitely unpack that in terms of the why. I've just realized I've forgotten to introduce you, Mac. I've just assumed that everybody that sees Mac's face on here, Mac Alongo, will be like, I know Mac. But if you don't know Mac is the CEO and founder of the Equal Group, which you were one of. I want to say you were one of the, I guess, OG like DEI consultants, or EDI consultants, actually, as you guys call yourselves. And from day one, and the reason that reminded me of it is when you talked about your background in energy and regulation, and obviously before that there was like consultancy as well. But from day one, you've always been very like data driven, like data and evidence driven, almost like as part of your USP, I feel like, compared to a lot of consultancies. So that's Mac. If anybody doesn't know Mac, you need to like look at Mac's profile, and he's going to be posting a lot more on LinkedIn as well. So you're in for a treat. So some of the things that you said about the social mobility and the why, I've got some people might remember this. I don't know how this is. This is a post that I posted a couple of years ago. It's one of my most liked posts, but this is an AI generation and an AI creation of the average FTSE CEO. It was done by People Managing People, and so they analysed the data from the FTSE 100 CEOs to kind of come up with average age, background. His name's Andy, by the way, and I've worked for a lot of Andys. So his name's Andy. He's 55. He's a Cambridge University economics grad. So that's the average. And, we do know in terms of the proportion that have been to private school, we know is very high. So at one stage, I want to say it was something like in 2019, it was like 48% of FTSE 100 CEOs were privately educated. In 2023, it went up to 66%. So it was almost going backwards a little bit, which I didn't even realize that. I'm not sure what it is for 2024. Yeah, so it's interesting. And then also, obviously, we've got things like, attendance at Cambridge and Oxford being very popular for, not just CEOs, but generally everybody that's at the top of society, right? So there is that issue. So let's just unpack the why then. Why do you think that, one of the things you said is organizations tend to all be happy to get behind it. Let's just tell it as it is, Mac. Why do you think that is compared to other protected characteristics?
I think it's easier for people to grapple with, and by that I mean, for a lot of us, we know about kind of systemic racism, we know about ableism, we know about misogyny, and there are some parallels between kind of what's happened in relation to diversity so far as gender dynamics are concerned. So, for the last 20 years or so, we've had kind of a bit of a drive for females in leadership and gender representation from a male-female perspective. The undertone to that was one that lacked intersectionality. So there was a perspective that actually gender diversity meant just getting white, middle-aged, middle-class women into leadership. And that kind of, they kind of stopped there. And I feel like the evolution of that has been, okay, we've let some women into leadership. We've let our wives and their friends into leadership positions. Why are people still complaining? And then there's all of these other characteristics that come up, and that actually the easiest narrative to kind of the easiest next sort of subsequent step is then to say, right, people that look like me, what can I do to support those individuals? And it also plays into this like cute narrative that people can work themselves up by their bootstraps, and there's no issues with the system as long as you're willing to work hard enough and do the right things. There's also an undercurrent of assimilation. So it's easier for somebody from a lower working class background to mask or pretend to be of privilege. And that again just makes it easier for people to kind of just slip in. And we see it a lot in I guess in relation to other protected characteristics where people mask and put on this kind of this acceptable face of who they are within the workplace. You know, you can only do that so far when you're of an ethnic minority background. You can mask all you want, you can change your accent, you can dress prim and proper, but you can kind of never hide your black face. So it's a lot harder to gain that level of acceptance if that is the barrier. And I guess, you know, the underlying issue here, and I'm not sure how far I'm deviating from your kind of notes, but the underlying kind of issue from my perspective is kind of capitalism and how capitalism works. And actually you need people that are less than to take up positions in society that you don't desire. And it's easier to do when you create those divides, and those divides are easier to create where you've got quite clear differences. When those differences are less clear, so when we're talking about people of the same race, people of the same religion, it's harder to create that divide and that delineation that allows you to treat them significantly worse than you would treat yourself.
Yeah. Wow, Mac's gone deep already, and we're only like 10 minutes in. But do you know what? You've touched on so many angles of it, though, in terms of, I guess, almost like from the organizational perspective, in terms of, you know, why maybe do the individuals at the top that maybe, especially if the leadership is quite homogenous or the workforce is quite homogenous, why does it seem more appealing almost, right, to those individuals? And then, you know, you kind of gave us a little sort of touch on almost like the potted history of, I guess, sort of this work, you know, DEI initiatives and the groups that have maybe benefited. And I do want to just pause there for a bit, because I think that's really useful. And it's something that we've heard, but maybe we don't talk about it a lot. And when you look at the groups that have benefited and the progress that has made, I guess there is therefore an argument for, you know, changing the emphasis of D&I as it progresses, right? Almost like as a natural journey. So you're right in terms of started with gender, not very intersectional, and so there's a certain group that's been benefited. And I think we can see that if you look at things like the pay gaps. You know, if you break the pay gap down in the UK by gender and ethnicity, and if we could overlay, for example, if we could overlay like regional variances and stuff like that, you'd probably see even more starkly. But you're right, there are certain groups that have definitely benefited. So therefore, very blunt DI initiatives that say, for example, just say, right, we're going to just target all women are going to get such and such. They are potentially too crude, right? Would you agree with that?
Yeah, absolutely. And I think you can't get away from the psychological aspects of, we all kind of see talent in our own image. We all see life and people through our own lenses, and it's natural to have an affinity for people that look like you, that talk like you, that have experienced life as you've experienced it. It creates less tension and less friction. So if I go into a room with people that all look like me and all have a similar family or background, all have similar experience, I don't have to work that hard to strike up a conversation. I don't have to work that hard to make people feel included. Whereas if there's somebody that's distinctly different to you, that is more tasking. And I guess that can be seen as one of these barriers that people aren't necessarily ready to overcome.
Yeah, definitely. And then I wanted to touch on, you said something about capitalist society. Wow, Mac, man, you'd really, Mac's going in, right? So the thing, and and anybody that's UK based, but really, if you're in the West, if I just call it that, you do sometimes look at the structures. And something that I used to share many years ago, even before Rishi Sunak became Prime Minister, because I think when you look at things like the top of the country, it gives you an insight actually into the psyche of the country. And so of the 58 prime ministers, now I'm missing Keir Starmer, he didn't make this analysis, but of the 58 prime ministers, 31 went to Oxford, 14 went to Cambridge, which is 45 of the 58, or 78%. And then when in terms of the schools, now we're talking about public schools rather than private schools, right? 20 went to Eton, 7 went to Harrow, 6 to Westminster. So 33 or 57% of the UK's prime ministers went to 3 schools. More than half. It's crazy, right? And this links back to what you were saying, in terms of the system, right? That, and I don't want to go too far into it, but part of the issue of social mobility is it kind of is what sustains capitalism to an extent. That's why it's really hard to break, right? Would you agree with that?
Absolutely. And there's again that narrative around the schools that prime ministers have gone to, like it's a really great story for Eton and Cambridge and Oxford to say, come here and pay all of these fees because the likelihood of you becoming the next PM or the next cabinet member is significantly higher than if you went to any other school. So there's that commercial angle. But then there's also the angle around how people work themselves out of capitalism, and there has to be some kind of carrot to incentivize people to do, again, I'm not sure how far to take this, but just do all of the things that people do to get ahead. And I've read one quote one time that said, you don't earn £1 billion, you take £1 billion. And it's this kind of the behaviors that manipulate and steal and pillage from other communities that drives this behavior. But again, I think it comes back to like seeing potential in your own image and good, kind of co-signing people that have been to schools that you've been to. It reinforces this self-fulfilling kind of prophecy of look how great I am, and look at all the greatness that comes from people like me, if that makes sense.
And it also links to, and I'm going to come to Nyambi has put a really interesting comment about intersectionality, so I'm going to come to that in a second. But I guess we couldn't really talk about social mobility and the barriers to social mobility without talking about capitalism and the structures that are in place that potentially stop that, right? And you sort of talked about seeing people in your own image, but it links to, I'll tell you what, it got me thinking about, this myth of meritocracy. And there's a really good book that came out last year, but I can't remember what it's called, but it was specifically about the city and the myth of meritocracy. And when we talk about the city, because it was talking about the City of London, it was really talking about not just the financial services, but all of the lawyers and the accountants and the advisors, you know, that ecosystem of the city, and how over the last, 20, 30 years, it's kind of tried to kid itself that it's meritocratic. Do you know what I mean? Particularly around things like this, the universities that they take people from and all of that stuff. And it links now actually into this narrative around actually DEI is bad, meritocracy is good. But what happens is when you do that, you end up with people leaning in more into the elite establishments. Do you know what I mean? It's kind of like a catch-22 almost, because they're basically saying, actually, we're just taking the best of the best. That's why we're targeting the Russell Group of universities, if they're in the UK, or the Ivy League, right?
I think that narrative really works in a world where information isn't as dispersed as it is now. I think the rise of AI, the rise of internet access has given everybody access to really great information. I always use this analogy, or used to always use it. I haven't used it for a number of years now. But if you're looking for a web developer, are you going to go to Oxford and Cambridge and say, I want the best web developer from Oxford and Cambridge? No, you're probably not. You're going to go to somebody that has, potentially dropped out of college at 12 and started coding really early and just knows everything there is to know about coding. We're moving into a world now where knowledge, it's not necessarily about knowledge, it's about the application of knowledge. And I think that's what these institutions, these historic institutions, are finding really difficult to really demonstrate. And I think to some extent we're going to end up in this world where they have to reinforce that narrative that if you go to Oxford or Cambridge or Eton or wherever it is, that it's not necessarily because of the knowledge you get, but it's the access to networks and it's the access to institutions.
Yeah, absolutely. And we could, in terms of linking onto the myth of meritocracy, one of the things that I was going to say, and I actually think part of what has toppled DEI in the US, I'm just going to put it out there, is it's the billionaires controlling the elite universities, right? Let's call it as it is, right? We're starting to see that actually a lot of people, or more people, are realizing that people can pay their way into a lot of the elite universities. And what I mean by that is obviously the people that are funding the universities and, the connections and all of that stuff. So actually sometimes from a meritocracy perspective, the individuals that are going to some of these elite institutions aren't even necessarily, as you say, the best of the best or the brightest. And actually, and what you said there also links to something that I heard on. So yesterday, Diary of CEO, there was an emergency. I don't know whether you watched it. There was an emergency session that's been broadcast, Diary of a CEO podcast, talking about the sort of post-Trump world, and they did discuss DEI. So I'd encourage anybody, if you haven't listened to it, to go and listen back. It was a Zoom episode, which they don't usually do. So it was Stephen Bartlett with Scott Galloway, who was a kind of like slightly left of centre commentator, talks a lot about masculinity. Daniel Priestley and Constantine, surname I can't remember. But Daniel Priestley was saying, just as you said there, Mac, in terms of the skills that people are needing, that the sorts of skills that schools and educational institutions now are teaching is so outdated for the new age, right? So I wonder whether that is going to be a real positive in terms of social mobility. Are people going to start realizing that the skills that are needed are different for the future jobs?
I think there's something really interesting about this whole notion of billionaires backing universities and academic institutions. And then also for me, it calls into question, what is the purpose of education? What is the purpose of these establishments? And a lot of it isn't really to educate. Complete conspiracy theorist here, so excuse me, I don't want to offend anyone, but a lot of these institutions are money-making vehicles. They're there to make money. So if we fool ourselves into saying that they're there to educate and to be these gatekeepers of knowledge and intelligence, that's an absolute insert explicit. It's just not true. It's just not true. These are commercial organizations that are here to make money, and part of their making money is by attracting donors, attracting funders, and then pandering to those same donors and funders. And again, to your point around meritocracy, places are given to the sons and daughters of people that fund universities. It's not rocket science. If you're being funded by a billionaire or millionaire, and that millionaire asks you to make a space on the course for his son that is below average intelligence, you're gonna look the other way, and you're gonna offer him a place or her a place.
And it also links to something that you said. I think you said something about access to networks, and it links to kind of like social capital, which I don't know whether we're going to have time to delve into social capital, but I wanted to circle back to something that Nyambi said. Good morning, Nyambi. Thank you for joining us. Intersectionality is at the heart of social mobility. And I do think there is a narrative, I think, here that you picked up on, Yam, which I think is worth talking about. Because there is a narrative around social mobility now in terms of, if we loop back to where we started, and organisations that seem happier to go down the route of social mobility. Some will argue, actually, if you almost like use social mobility as your first filter, you will also tackle some of the other protected characteristics, like, for example, race in particular, which I don't think we've got long enough to go into why race and gender in particular have been, sort of like, almost like it's like in the US, DEI is literally just boiled down to race and gender, right? I'm just going to leave it there with race as the leading one. But Yam's called out a really interesting point, because I hear this a lot in terms of, actually, and I believe there are some universities in the US as well that when they moved away from affirmative action, they moved away from something called like adversity scores, for example, that take into account several factors, some of which are deprivation. So there's an argument that actually, if you use that lens, not only is it kind of almost like a more acceptable, kind of like characteristic that everybody can get on board with, but you will also tackle, a greater proportion, for example, of of the global majority of non-whites because of deprivation in those communities. What's your thoughts on that?
Yes, it's I guess targeted universalism in terms of trying to make sure that you're picking up as many people as possible through your interventions. I think it's a really robust approach, but the narrative is such that, and I think this is what we see with D&I in the States, where if the narrative is not communicated in the right way, and I think that calls into question, for me personally, what is the why? Why are you doing this? Is it because you genuinely want to make change, or is it because you want to be seen to be not racist, or seen to be not discriminatory, or seen to be not classist? The aesthetic for some organizations is more important than the reality. And I think that's where we need to really challenge, what does good EDI look like? Is it just about the rhetoric? Is it just about visuals? Or is it something more meaningful in terms of societal change and impact?
Absolutely. I'm going to bring in Martin Dempsey's made a comment here as well. I've had to click onto my phone, Martin, to see the whole thing. So it says here, the US exposes the fact that the meritocracy argument is in bad faith. The cabinet nominees being celebrated by the MEI. So that's what's MEI stand for again? Meritocracy, excellence, intelligence advocates. I don't know whether you knew that, Mac. Meritocracy, excellence, intelligence, I believe. Martin, correct me if I'm wrong. Advocates are so clearly underqualified and inexperienced for those roles that it's nothing to do with meritocracy. Part of what we need to do better in the DI world, this links to what you were saying, Mac, to combat this, is to continue to build better business cases and greater evidence for the fact that opening up avenues for talent to achieve its potential delivers more effective teams and more successful organizations. I definitely think it links to how DEI is being explained. I was actually on a call yesterday with mainly a US based call, and I was quite surprised at the conversation around DEI and the different views of what DEI would like. I was literally shocked. Like, I'm not kidding you. And I thought, I always thought it's no wonder. Like, but some of that I take on us, as in, have we just not explained this properly? Like, because what are people actually talking about?
But my marketing manager shared something with me the other day, which was a video that I think went viral on TikTok or one of these apps, of a chief diversity officer for the fire department talking about, representing the community. And then when I think she was asked a question about the practicalities of doing the job, the statement was something along the lines of, if you get into a position where I have to carry you out of your fire, you've done something wrong. And it's like, you missed the point there. And I think in some quarters, D&I has become this thing about representation, not necessarily about the work that needs to be done.
100%. I mean, and Bo on YouTube's put, merit includes anyone. And I think, so there is this element of DEI, and the one because this is the last in this like mini series, and we're gonna wrap things up now. But the one thing I hadn't really talked about, and maybe I need to bring this mini series back, because I haven't really sort of like challenged, tackled head on almost like some of the, you could almost like say, legitimate criticisms around DEI, right?
Oh yeah, 100%. 100%.
Because you know what I'm like, we've spoken about this in private, and I'm like, I don't want to come on here and be dragging anybody, right? DEI, but
I think some people need to be dragged. I think that's one of my criticisms about the D&I space. That we're too nice. We're really nice about really rubbish stuff.
Mac's telling it as it is. Mac,
I'm going to get cancelled. I'm pretty sure 2025
Do you know, I almost got cancelled.
Really?
I think I once talked about this on it. I almost got cancelled going into an organisation because I wanted to create space for people to have conversations like this around some of the challenges around, for example, men's issues and gender. I almost got cancelled.
No way.
Yeah, we do need to talk about it. So this thing around DEI being anti-meritocratic. Actually, literally, as I was lying in my bed this morning, I was like, there is a headline that's DEI is anti-meritocracy, discuss, right? Because that is the narrative that's out there, and people absolutely believe that. So we have got a work to do. Do you know what I mean? And whether there is a work to do in terms of revisiting, as Martin said, revisiting the business case, and people getting really sharp on that. I mean, I know there was all that stuff in the press about, McKinsey and this, that, and the McKinsey, that was one study, and they never claimed correlation. If anybody doesn't know what I'm talking about, just Google it. Actually wasn't one of the studies I used to use. I used to use a BCG one, but that's just my...
But I've always been very cautious using McKinsey generally, because again, I don't think that's the point that they were making. I think it's been misconstrued, where people think that just by having diversity, you automatically become more productive and more innovative. So no, that's never been the case.
Exactly.
And actually, what you see with organizations that are lacking in maturity on their D&I journey is that usually they actually go backwards if they start to invest in diversity too early, because they don't necessarily have the systems, the processes, the people competence to deal with that level of diversity. So you kind of have to ease people into it. And I think what we've seen over the last 5 years is that people rush to do diversity inclusion and rush to claim themselves anti-racist without really understanding what is racism before you can't be anti something you don't understand.
Oh, don't get me started on do not get me started on the DEI that is built on Robin DiAngelo and Ibrahim X Kendi. Like, we haven't got time. We haven't got long enough for that.
But it's linking it back to like the social mobility angle. This is also key, because again, what do people understand social mobility to be, and what is it that you're trying to achieve through social mobility? Because and that, again, it links to the broader D&I discussion, where people want different people to come in as long as they're willing to do things the way that we do them, and do things as we would do them. So it's like, actually, what benefit do you get from diversity if you're just replicating yourself in other people?
And I think we're going to wrap up. I think actually the argument for the argument for organizations having the social mobility lens, and I'm going to ask you in a minute almost like what your one piece of advice is for organizations that are kind of like looking at this. But one of the great case studies for social mobility, for greater awareness, and I promise you I'm not being political, right, but it's the Tory party, in terms of, if you were to look at the even like the leadership campaigns and then who got in and all of that. So on the face of it, diversity, you know, female, you know, people of color, etc., etc. You look at the schooling and the education and the perspectives, all the same. So that is not diversity. And one of my favorite studies, so I mentioned BCG, so Boston Consulting Group have got a study called The Mix That Matters. I don't know if that's one that you came across, Matt, from, you know, many years ago, but that really talks about the impact of diversity on innovation, right? And it looks at innovation revenues. And when it talks about diversity, obviously it does talk about, you know, country of origin, and it talks about gender, but it also talks about things like industry background and having a variety of that and different career paths and whatever. So for me, social mobility, which is, you know, part of this discussion, is just all part of that broader lens of understanding, you know, what do we even mean by diversity in terms of, from a business case perspective, are we talking about, you know, discrimination, inclusion and belonging? Are we talking about innovation and revenues and product and service and understanding market? They're all different things, do you know what I mean? So, but it's good that, you know, that people are kind of like broadening out their perspectives, I think. Last word to you, Mac, in terms of, for anybody that's watching this, and I didn't even get into how people measure it. So how people measure social mobility. But if there's an organization watching this that's thinking, we don't currently really do anything, you know, in this, but, you know, I can hear people talking about it. Where should I start and what should I do? Obviously, apart from getting you in to look at their data and kind of run some stats for them, where should they start?
So I think the Social Mobility Foundation is always the one that I point people to. There's tons of research that they've done around the life outcomes of people from low socioeconomic backgrounds. So free school meal is an indicator, parental occupation is an indicator. To your question, there's a number of ways that you can measure social mobility, but none of them are perfect. And actually, I think that's one of the challenges with social mobility, defining it. What do you mean? What is it you're trying to achieve? And I think actually, unless you can answer that question in terms of what is it you're trying to achieve, then there's no point really rushing into it. But I think there has to be, and this is my advice to all leaders, and it kind of comes back to this whole Donald Trump thing, because one of the things I respect about Donald Trump is he's doing what he wants, and I think for leaders, just do what you want. Like don't pander to what should I be doing, what should I be seen to do. And I've always said this from day one. I firmly respect any organization, any private sector organizations desire to want to be racist, misogynistic, whatever it is, because hopefully the world will treat you accordingly. And I think there has to be something to be said around organizations or leaders leaning into this with purity. So do it because you want to do it. Don't do it because you're scared of people calling you out or cancelling you. That is the worst reason to do anything. And I think we've seen too much of that over the last 5 years, where people have done stuff not because they believed in it, not because they wanted the outcome, but because they were scared of being cancelled or dragged on social media.
Yeah, that's a real challenge. So what you're basically saying there, Mac, is that leaders just need to be authentic in this space, right? To use one of the, you know, the irony of using that word, but be about it. If you're going to be it, if you're going to do it, do it. If you're not going to do it, don't do it. But just, you know, stop saying you're going to do it and pretend like you're playing this game and then you're not really serious about it. Yeah. That's great.
I'm definitely interested in coming back to your session when you're going to drag everyone. So let me know when that one is.
Yeah, I will do that. I'm going to just share the last few comments that we've had. Thank you so much for joining us. There's DNI leaders delivering real results and value will always be needed, especially in these chaotic times. I think you're right there. Because I was talking to a global group of network leaders, some in the States and other countries, and we were even just talking about holding safe spaces for people to talk, regardless of, you know, which way they voted or whatever, because everybody's just feeling a little bit kind of wobbly, right? There are also organizations and leaders truly committed to social impact, and we've seen that even in the States, that, you know, the some of the organizations that have said we're doubling down on it, right? And then a comment here from Reg Amo, good morning. DEI for me was about the effectiveness, about your operational teams. If you have homogenous teams, they don't function well. When you have teams that are all middle class or all one gender, etc., they have massive blind spots. They don't change the way they do things. Yeah, absolutely, the blind spots is true. And if anybody that's watching wants to know more about the States, so yesterday I reposted something from David Glasgow at the Meltzer Centre. I don't know whether you checked those out, Mac, as well. The Meltzer Centre for Inclusion at NYU, which is the New York University, and it's really headed up by, as background, they're really employment rights lawyers, and you've got Kenji Yoshino of the Work of Covering. He's there as well. So if you want to know kind of like the latest in terms of what's going on in the States from a legal perspective, especially if you're supporting global clients or clients with a US head office, and so you want to be tapped in, they've done some brilliant stuff. They've done like interviews with New York Times and HBR articles and stuff recently as well. But yeah, social mobility, definitely something to think about. And if you want to know more about Mac and the work that he does, where's the best place to get in touch with you, Mac? On here or through the website?
Always posting on LinkedIn. You can check my messages out here.
Mac will be posting more on LinkedIn. You heard it here.
Absolutely.
Mac, thank you so much for jumping on. Honestly, it's been so much fun. You've been an absolute star.
Thank you for having
me. Joanne, if you're watching the replay, I hope you get better soon.
Yes, and Joanne, I'm sorry that I've butchered social mobility, so you can feel free to come back and let everyone know what the real research says about social mobility.
Thank you all, everyone, for joining us. If you've joined us live, and if you've watched this on the replay, thank you for taking 40 minutes out of your day to be with us. Take care. Have a great weekend.